It's Our Story. Eleanor Smith, Atlanta, Georgia.
In terms of sexuality, I'm sure disabled people are as different from each other as non-disabled people. So I'll just speak for myself. I did not discover myself as a sexual person until I was in my 20s. And that's kind of late. I didn't know that my body could be sexual and have a great time being sexual. My personal body. I'm not talking about relationships. I'm just talking about myself as a body. I didn't really experience being incredibly turned on and having a great sexual time until I was in my 30s, in fact. And then someone pressed the right buttons and it was off to the races for the next decades. But I think the reason that I discovered that, part of the reason I discovered that so late, I found love earlier, believe me, but I didn't find my own sexuality. Here was a person who had been operated on many times. My body had been a source of pain, considerable pain, and also been very, very treated like an object. Back in those days, a doctor would come around if you were in the hospital with a team of other interns looking at you, might sit you up on a little table, hardly make any remarks to you, if at all, and say, she this and she that, and bring out your x-rays, and you're sitting there maybe in your underwear at age 5. Your body has been a source of physical pain often, not always, and also often very objectified to where you really do kind of split your mind off from your body. Not in any psychotic way, but you just have to kind of divorce yourself from all that's going on to you right at that time. So I think it made sense in my case that it took a long time for me to be able to enjoy my own sexuality, my own sexual responses. In terms of being a lesbian, that's a huge subject. Because I think, a lot of people could be bisexual, and I could easily have been bisexual. I had some attraction to guys, but I fell in love with a woman first. But I had a big crush on a guy earlier, too. He was very sweet. Again, because I was assertive, independent, not exactly the kind who knew how to do some things that women are supposed to do. It just wasn't me. And a lot of women like that do get married to guys who aren't looking for a certain thing. But in my case, the first people that I really bonded with were women, and getting along just on a personal level and just really bonding. I was a real lesbian, not just because men didn't work out, not that at all. But I could have been probably bisexual in a world that didn't have sexism or ableism. But that's not the world we live in, and so, patriarchy had a lot to do with some of my choices, but it wasn't just a mental thing. It was a very emotional and sexual direction. It wasn't like I decided, sexism is bad, so I'm going to go be a lesbian. It wasn't like that.
The It's Our Story project is a national effort to make disability history public and accessible. Visit us at www.itsourstory.org or on the It's Our Story project YouTube channel.
I think a lot of us globally, people who are working around issues of sexuality, have felt that we need to be able to speak about economic issues, about questions of political economy, both in terms of their descriptive value, kind of how do people of different sexualities do things like survive, get housing, get jobs, the material conditions of people's lives with respect to their sexualities. But I think that we're also trying to think about what the discourse on political economy can do for critiques of sexuality in a kind of theoretical, historical, other kinds of analytic ways. One thing that I think anthropologists and particularly ethnographers can do is think about what the law looks and feels like in everyday life for people, particularly people who don't have a lot of economic or political or social power. So one of the things that I was able to show is that the law says one thing on paper, but in everyday life, what the law often ends up doing is facilitating an extra legal space where police and local shopkeepers and people passing by on the street and sex workers operate. And they operate through a series of very careful and minute and conscious negotiations with one another. So the law sort of, if it does something, I think it makes a space, and then people behave within that space that may not necessarily be commensurate with what the law says. I'm very interested in conversations around materiality, political economy, class, and temporality, and this kind of very old discussion that anthropologists have been having about progress and modernity and time, really, because anthropology has been so much formed around the question of who is more primitive than who is the proper subject of anthropological discussion. And, of course, anthropologists have done a lot of work to problematize all of those kinds of categories. So I think very early on, the discipline had to grapple with questions of time, of, who do we consider to be advanced, who do we consider not to be advanced, what is the relationship between these groups of people. So today I'm going to draw on that and frame our panel in part in terms of that question. In my own research and other kinds of engagements in India, something I've noticed is that sex work is being talked about as a vestige of the past, particularly when it's conflated with trafficking. So part of the rationale for eradicating sex work has been to say, and this is coming from policymakers both within and outside of India, certain media representations have done this as well, has been to say that a modern society has no place for this practice. At the same time, there is a new visibility that LGBTQ folks are enjoying, and a particular segment of LGBTQ populations. And now we have a kind of global human rights discourse, which is really framing gay rights as the future, as a kind of a sign of progress and a sign of, a kind of the membership that one has to the community of nations now includes embracing gay rights. So there's a funny tension, I think, between seeing gay rights as the future and sex work as the past. I obviously think it need not be that way, and in everyday life it certainly doesn't work that way, but there's a discourse, and by that I mean a kind of productive conversation that's happening around these things that I think can help us to think more deeply and more clearly about what's going on around sexuality.